Case 1. Carol Skidmore, Texas, Florida. In December 1980, hunters in Florida stumbled upon the skeletal remains of a woman near Fountain. The discovery set off a chain of events that would captivate the community for over 4 decades. The identity of the woman remained a mystery, but what made this case even more chilling was the twisted history of her disappearance. Carol Skidmore, her husband, and their young son had vanished in 1977, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. Just weeks later, the body of her son was found in Tennessee, murdered and left in a remote area. Her husband, in a shocking twist, was discovered dead in Arkansas by suicide, but Carol's fate remained elusive. Despite numerous leads and a years-long investigation, the question of what had happened to Carol Skidmore went unanswered until modern science finally uncovered the truth in 2025. The initial investigation into Carol's disappearance was marked by confusion and frustration. Detectives quickly turned to the possibility that her case might be linked to other missing persons. In the 80s and 90s, they worked tirelessly, conducting interviews, following leads, and canvassing neighborhoods, hoping that one small clue might finally crack the case. But every lead seemed to fizzle out. The lack of evidence left law enforcement in a constant holding pattern, where progress was slow and hopes of finding answers began to fade. DNA analysis at the time was primitive, and no matches were found, adding to the sense of futility that hung over the investigation. For the next several decades, the case sat cold, a forgotten name on a growing list of unsolved mysteries. The problem wasn't just the lack of new evidence, it was the absence of modern tools that could have made a difference. In the early years, chain of custody issues and limited resources complicated matters. The lack of funding, combined with shifts in law enforcement priorities, left Carol's case languishing. But the most damning factor was the absence of technological advances. DNA testing, which might have been pivotal, was still in its infancy, and the case was stuck in the past. It was only a matter of time before the case would be overshadowed by others, until 2025, when a breakthrough finally brought the mystery back into focus. The breakthrough came when the Bay County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit revisited the case in 2025. Armed with modern forensic technology, including DNA analysis and forensic genealogy, they turned their attention back to the skeletal remains found near Fountain, Florida. This time, the technology was ready to answer the questions that had plagued the investigation for so long. Forensic genealogy, a revolutionary tool in modern crime solving, was used to connect DNA from the remains to distant relatives, eventually identifying Carol Skidmore. The match was a moment of triumph for investigators, but it was only the beginning of uncovering the full story. While the identification of Carol's remains brought the Skidmore family some sense of closure, the details of her death remained shrouded in uncertainty. As of now, no arrest has been made in Carol's case. The murder investigation is still open, and authorities continue to seek answers. The key to unlocking the full truth remains elusive. Some have speculated that Carol's husband's suicide may have been linked to her death, but without concrete evidence, investigators cannot say for certain. Was Carol's death the result of a tragic domestic situation? Was there something more sinister at play? These are questions that have yet to be answered. For Carol's family, the identification of her remains was a bittersweet relief. After decades of waiting and wondering, they finally knew where she was. But that was only half the battle. As one family member put it, "Finally, we know where she is. But what really happened to Carol? That's the hardest part." The family's grief is now compounded by the knowledge that, even with the identification, they may never fully understand why Carol disappeared or how she met her tragic end. The case remains open, and while new technology has provided some answers, the mystery of Carol Skidmore's death lingers. This case stands as a testament to the power of modern forensic techniques, especially genetic genealogy, in solving cold cases that had long seemed unsolvable. Carol Skidmore's story is one of both hope and heartbreak. Hope that the advances in science can help bring justice, and heartbreak that, for her family, the hardest question may never be answered. Despite the identification, the case remains unsolved, leaving her loved ones with an enduring uncertainty that no amount of technology can erase. As investigators continue to search for answers, Carol's family holds on to the hope that one day, the truth will finally be uncovered. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with, "I am still here." Let's see who is still watching. Case 2. Emery Earl McVeigh, Bastrop, Texas. In the summer of 1997, the small town of Bastrop, Texas, was gripped by fear. A series of violent attacks had left the community paralyzed with uncertainty. The rapes, which began with the assault of a woman in the dead of night, soon escalated into a chilling pattern of terror. Each victim was left emotionally and physically scarred, and the town's peaceful atmosphere was shattered. Despite a thorough investigation and the collection of DNA evidence, no suspect was ever identified, and the case slowly faded into the background, another unsolved mystery in the growing list of cold cases. As the years passed, the fear that once plagued Bastrop seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of resignation. Justice, it seemed, would never come. The early stages of the investigation were marked by confusion and frustration. Detectives struggled to find connections between the crimes, and despite their best efforts, they could not pinpoint a suspect. The evidence collected from the crime scenes, though critical, failed to match anyone in the national database. Witnesses were interviewed, but none could provide a description or solid lead. Theories were formed, but they quickly dissolved as each lead turned out to be a dead end. As the case grew colder, the DNA evidence, though carefully preserved, remained dormant. It was a silent reminder of the failed search for justice. In the years that followed, the case languished in obscurity. The lack of new evidence and the limited forensic technology available at the time meant that the investigation could only go so far. The DNA evidence collected from the scenes, while invaluable, was not sophisticated enough to be fully analyzed or cross-referenced with modern databases. Chain of custody issues and lab bottlenecks delayed the analysis, and despite a few sporadic cold case reviews, the case stagnated. Investigators, though dedicated, were left with no fresh leads, and the memories of the attacks slowly began to fade from public consciousness. But in 2021, the Texas Rangers decided to revisit the case, spurred by advancements in forensic technology. DNA analysis had made significant strides, particularly in the field of genetic genealogy. This new tool had begun solving cases that once seemed impossible, and the Rangers saw an opportunity to finally close the chapter on this long, unsolved mystery. Working with genetic genealogists, they began to cross-reference the DNA from the crime scenes with the vast databases of genetic information available to the public. Forensic genealogy allowed them to trace family connections, leading them to a match with a distant relative of the perpetrator. The breakthrough was a moment of both triumph and frustration. They had finally identified the rapist, but the man they were looking for had been dead for 15 years. Emery Earl McVeigh, the man responsible for the attacks, had died in 2005, a decade and a half before the breakthrough. While his identity provided the answers that had long eluded investigators, it also meant that justice could never be served in the traditional sense. No arrest could be made, no trial could take place, and no sentencing could be handed down. The news of McVeigh's death left the victims' families with mixed emotions. They finally had the closure they had waited for, but it was bittersweet. They would never have the opportunity to confront McVeigh in court, to hear him speak of his actions, or to seek the justice they had long desired. The motive behind McVeigh's crimes remains unclear, though investigators suggest that unresolved personal trauma played a role. However, the lack of answers regarding why he chose to commit such heinous acts only added to the sorrow of the case's resolution. Was it a product of personal demons, or was there a deeper, more disturbing reason for his actions? The truth, like McVeigh, had passed beyond reach. What remained was a legacy of pain and unanswered questions, leaving the community and the victims' families to wonder if they would ever fully understand the why behind his crimes. For the victims' families, the identification of McVeigh brought a sense of relief, but it was a relief tinged with frustration. One relative summed up the complicated emotions perfectly. "It's bittersweet. He'll never answer for what he did." The victims had waited for so long, but their quest for justice was now marred by the fact that McVeigh would never be held accountable in a court of law. The closure they sought was incomplete, leaving them with the lingering sense that true justice had not been achieved. The case of Emery Earl McVeigh highlights the immense power of modern forensic techniques to solve cold cases, but it also underscores the painful reality that justice is sometimes elusive. While McVeigh's identification brought closure to the case, the death of the perpetrator before he could face trial serves as a reminder that not all answers come with the resolution victims and their families deserve. Despite the progress made, the case leaves lingering questions, a testament to the complexity of justice in a world where time and circumstances can prevent it from being fully realized. Case 3. Pauline Brazeau, Calgary, Canada. In 1976, the murder of Pauline Brazeau stunned Calgary, leaving the community reeling in disbelief. A woman known for her warmth and kindness, Pauline was found dead in her home under mysterious circumstances. The case quickly gained attention, but despite early investigations, no answers came. Police initially pursued several suspects, but each lead seemed to evaporate. With little forensic evidence to guide them, and conflicting witness testimonies that left more questions than answers, the case grew cold. As months turned into years, Pauline's death faded from the headlines, becoming just another unsolved mystery in a growing list of cold cases. But for those who knew her, the question of what had truly happened to Pauline never ceased to haunt them. The initial investigation in 1976 was intense, with detectives working to uncover the truth behind Pauline's untimely death. Several individuals were questioned, including acquaintances and those who had interacted with her in the days leading up to her murder. But the investigation hit roadblocks early. The forensic evidence collected was sparse, and the lack of solid leads made it difficult to connect the dots. Witnesses were interviewed, but their recollections varied. Some saw a man leaving her home, while others couldn't recall anything suspicious. Each potential lead turned out to be a dead end, and the case quickly became one of many forgotten mysteries. As time passed, Pauline's family and friends were left without the answers they so desperately sought. The investigation, though active in its early stages, eventually stalled, with few updates and little hope of resolution. For the next several decades, the case went cold. Forensic evidence, which might have been crucial in solving the case, was lost in the chaos of the 1970s. At the time, protocols for preserving evidence were not as stringent as they are today, and the loss of key materials, such as fibers and blood samples, severely hampered further investigation. With no new leads emerging, the case was pushed aside as law enforcement turned their focus to other, more recent crimes. Over the years, the lack of new information and the absence of technological advancements meant that the case remained unsolved. Pauline's family, though devastated by the loss, held on to a sliver of hope that someday the truth would come to light. But as each year passed, that hope began to fade, and the search for answers seemed more distant. In 2021, a breakthrough came when the Calgary Police Service decided to reopen the case, spurred by advancements in forensic technology. With the development of DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy, the tools that were unavailable in the 1970s suddenly offered new possibilities. DNA from the crime scene, which had been preserved all those years, was re-examined with modern techniques. Forensic genealogists were enlisted to trace the DNA through public genealogy databases, connecting distant relatives to the perpetrator. This technology, which had already been used to solve many other cold cases, was about to offer the long-awaited answers in Pauline's case. The investigators' renewed focus on the case finally yielded results, when DNA evidence linked the crime to a man from Sundre, Alberta. In early 2025, the man from Sundre was arrested and charged in connection with Pauline's murder. He pled guilty to manslaughter, a charge that would significantly reduce the legal consequences of his actions. The revelation of the man's identity, however, did little to explain the full circumstances of Pauline's death. His motives, though speculated upon, remained murky. The man did not offer a full explanation of why he committed the crime, leaving the family with an additional layer of sorrow. While justice had been served in the legal sense, it felt incomplete to those who had waited for decades for the truth. There were still unanswered questions, and the resolution did little to bring the closure that Pauline's family had hoped for. For Pauline's family, the resolution of the case was a bittersweet moment. After nearly 50 years of waiting, they finally had answers, but the process had come too late. One family member summed it up best. "Justice is served, but it's been too long. We'll never fully heal from this." The wounds of time could never fully be healed by a legal victory. Though they had the name of the man responsible, the emotional toll of the years without answers weighed heavily on them. The community, too, felt a sense of closure, but it was tempered with the knowledge that justice had come far too late. Pauline Brazeau's case is a stark reminder of how time can hinder the pursuit of justice. While forensic technology has revolutionized the way cold cases are solved, the damage done by decades of inaction and lost evidence can never be undone. Yet the resolution of this case shows that even the oldest mysteries can be unraveled with the right tools and the persistence of those dedicated to seeking the truth. For Pauline's family, the case's resolution will always remain a painful victory. Justice served, but at the cost of too many lost years. Case 4. Louisa Dunn, Bristol, UK. In 1967, Louisa Dunn's brutal murder sent shockwaves through the quiet streets of Bristol. A beloved elderly woman, Louisa was found murdered in her home, a tragic event that would leave the community reeling and investigators scrambling for answers. Despite early efforts by law enforcement, the case quickly grew cold. At the time, the police had few leads to follow, and without the benefit of modern forensic technology, the investigation faltered. Witness testimonies were inconsistent, and the absence of key physical evidence left investigators with little to go on. As the weeks turned into months and then years, the case became just another unsolved mystery, a painful memory for those who knew Louisa, but a forgotten one for many others. In the early days of the investigation, detectives focused their efforts on interviewing neighbors, family members, and acquaintances. The goal was to piece together Louisa's life leading up to her death, hoping to uncover any clues that might reveal a potential suspect. Several individuals were questioned, but their recollections of the events surrounding Louisa's last days were vague or contradictory. A few reported seeing a man near her home shortly before her death, but there was no clear description, and no one could identify him with certainty. The lack of forensic tools at the time further hindered the investigation. With no physical evidence tying anyone to the crime, and no leads from witnesses, the case stalled. The years that followed saw the investigation slow to a crawl. The absence of modern forensic methods like DNA analysis meant that detectives had to rely on traditional investigative techniques, which, in this case, simply weren't enough. Forensic evidence, including fibers and potential DNA, was either not collected or was lost due to improper handling. The lack of technology made it difficult to draw connections between the crime and potential suspects. As the years passed, the case became a distant memory for many, buried under the weight of more recent crimes that demanded immediate attention. But for Louisa's family, the unresolved murder was a constant, painful reminder that justice had yet to be served. In 2025, 58 years after Louisa's death, a breakthrough came that would finally answer the questions that had haunted her family for decades. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy, allowed investigators to revisit the case with new hope. DNA from the crime scene, which had been carefully preserved for decades, was now reanalyzed using modern methods. Forensic genealogists worked alongside law enforcement to search through public genealogy databases, tracing DNA matches to distant relatives of the perpetrator. This led them to 92-year-old Ryland Headley, a man who had been living in Bristol at the time of Louisa's murder. The match was a startling revelation. After 58 years, the killer had been identified. In early 2025, Ryland Headley was arrested and charged in connection with Louisa's murder. The news of his arrest, while satisfying in its own right, was also a deeply complicated moment for those involved. Headley, now elderly and frail, pled guilty to manslaughter, a conviction that felt anticlimactic given the years that had passed and the horrific nature of Louisa's death. The full details of Headley's motive remained unclear, as he never provided a full explanation for his actions. Investigators speculated that there might have been a personal connection between him and Louisa, but with Headley's silence, the true reason behind the murder remained shrouded in mystery. For Louisa's family, the arrest of Headley brought a bittersweet sense of closure. After so many years of waiting and wondering, they finally knew who had committed the crime. But there was a deep sense of frustration, too. The long wait for justice meant that the emotional scars left by Louisa's death could never fully heal. One family member reflected, "It's hard to believe he was right under our noses for all these years." The knowledge that the perpetrator had been living so close by for so long added another layer of pain to the already heartbreaking situation. While justice had been served in a legal sense, the years lost meant that the family could never fully reclaim what had been taken from them. Louisa Dunn's case is a poignant reminder of the passage of time and the way that technology can reopen the doors to justice long after they've been shut. The identification of Ryland Headley through DNA analysis and forensic genealogy brought closure to a case that had seemed unsolvable. But the delayed justice also underscores the emotional toll that unresolved mysteries take on families. The case's resolution, while significant, is a complex one, with the truth of Louisa's death still partly hidden. What was once an unsolved mystery is now part of the historical record. But for Louisa's family, the journey to that truth was far longer and more painful than anyone could have anticipated. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe, and share to your loved ones to protect them from the same tragic happening to them in the future. Case 5. Carol Morgan, Linslade, UK. In 1981, the murder of Carol Morgan, a well-loved shopkeeper in Linslade, UK, shocked the tight-knit community. Found dead in the storeroom of her shop, Carol's death was a brutal blow to her family, friends, and the local neighborhood. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Detectives combed through her personal life and explored any potential business-related motives. Despite the early efforts, however, no clear answers emerged. Police focused on those closest to Carol, including her husband, Alan, but a lack of physical evidence and inconsistent witness testimonies left the case stagnant. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case grew cold, leaving those who cared about Carol in a painful state of uncertainty. The truth behind her death was locked away in the shadows, and as time passed, it seemed more and more unlikely that it would ever be found. In the first phase of the investigation, detectives turned to Carol's personal life, trying to understand if her relationships, especially with her husband, could provide any insight into the crime. Interviews were conducted with neighbors, business partners, and those who knew her well. Early theories focused on a possible business-related dispute or a hidden personal conflict. While several suspects were considered, each lead seemed to fizzle out. Investigators were left with little more than fragments of information, and the lack of physical evidence made it impossible to connect any of the theories to the crime. The police had no clear suspect, and despite their best efforts, they could not move forward with any confidence. The case slowly drifted into the realm of unsolved mysteries, a painful reminder of how quickly a life could be taken without justice. The years that followed saw the investigation lose momentum. With no significant developments, Carol's case became one of many forgotten cold cases. The lack of modern forensic tools in the 1980s, such as DNA analysis and digital record keeping, meant that crucial evidence was either lost or never fully processed. Forensic procedures were not as advanced as they are today, and the technology to conduct a thorough examination of the physical evidence simply wasn't available. The evidence that was collected, fibers, fingerprints, and other physical traces, was not preserved in a way that would have been helpful in a more advanced investigation. The lack of new leads and the absence of technological advances meant that the case stagnated. Each year that passed, Carol's family held on to hope, but as the investigation faded from public view, that hope became increasingly fragile. In 2024, however, a new chapter in the case began. A 6-year documentary investigation aired, revisiting old cold cases, including Carol's murder. The documentary sparked renewed public interest, leading to new witnesses coming forward. These fresh perspectives, combined with the public attention generated by the documentary, led to a reassessment of the case. Forensic experts re-examined the available evidence, and what had once seemed like dead ends began to unravel. The breakthrough came when modern forensic techniques, specifically DNA analysis, were used to reanalyze evidence that had long been dormant. This time, the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered a match, and the name that surfaced was Alan Morgan, Carol's husband. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community and Carol's family, who had never suspected him of being involved in her death. Alan Morgan's arrest in 2024, following the DNA match, was a moment of both triumph and heartbreak. For Carol's family, it was the closure they had been desperately seeking for decades, but it was not the resolution they had hoped for. Alan pled guilty to conspiracy to murder, admitting that he had hired a hitman to kill his wife in order to collect her life insurance. His motive was clear: financial desperation. Alan's debts had been mounting, and the prospect of Carol's insurance payout was too tempting for him to resist. The revelation of his involvement was devastating for the family. They had never imagined that the man closest to Carol, the one who was supposed to protect her, could be the one who orchestrated her murder. The family's grief was compounded by the knowledge that the man they trusted had been behind the most heinous act of all. As one family member put it, "It's devastating to think it was him all along, but at least we know the truth now." The truth, however, came at a price. The emotional scars of the years spent without answers could not be healed by a conviction. While the conviction brought justice in a legal sense, the betrayal was too much for the family to fully reconcile. The case, though solved, left a lasting impact on the family and the community. Carol Morgan's case, ultimately resolved after more than 4 decades, serves as a sobering reminder of the consequences of hidden motives and deceit. The investigation that seemed destined to remain unsolved was revitalized by modern forensic science and a renewed public interest, demonstrating the power of new technologies in solving cold cases. However, the case also highlights the emotional toll of delayed justice. For Carol's family, the truth about her death came too late to restore the years of grief and uncertainty. Justice, while served, was not the victory they had hoped for. It was simply a painful resolution to a tragedy that should never have happened. Case 6. Susan Goodwin, Adelaide, Australia. In 2002, Susan Goodwin's sudden disappearance from her home in Adelaide, Australia, sparked an urgent search that would span 2 decades. A mother of 2, Susan was last seen leaving her workplace on an ordinary afternoon, but after that, she vanished without a trace. The community rallied together in a desperate search, combing through neighborhoods, interviewing friends and family, and checking local hospitals. Despite a massive public effort, there was no sign of Susan. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the police began to fear the worst. Susan might never be found. The case became a grim reminder of how quickly a life could be taken, leaving behind only questions and heartache for those who loved her. In the early days of the investigation, authorities focused their efforts on understanding Susan's personal life and relationships. Detectives spoke with her family, friends, and coworkers, trying to piece together her movements and any possible clues that might explain why she vanished. They initially explored the possibility of foul play, considering both strangers and those closest to her. There were theories, including the possibility that Susan had left voluntarily or that she had encountered someone who meant her harm. However, each lead faltered. Witnesses provided vague or conflicting accounts, and without any solid forensic evidence or tangible clues, the case was left to linger in the shadows. The frustration of following leads that led nowhere was compounded by the sense that time was slipping away, making the chances of finding answers grow slimmer. As the years passed, Susan's case began to fade from the public's memory, becoming just another unsolved mystery in Adelaide's history. The police, while continuing to review the case periodically, were constrained by a lack of evidence and the limitations of forensic science at the time. The early efforts to collect DNA evidence had failed to produce any significant results, and as the years wore on, budget constraints further hindered the investigation. Advances in technology, particularly DNA testing, were still years away from offering the breakthroughs that would eventually make all the difference. Investigators, though determined, had few resources to keep the case alive, and the search for Susan was relegated to a forgotten chapter in the city's crime files. Her family was left to wonder whether they would ever learn the truth of what happened to her. Then, in 2024, something unexpected happened. A 6-year documentary investigation on unsolved cases in the region reignited public interest in Susan's disappearance. The airing of this documentary prompted several new witnesses to come forward, some offering key details that had not been available during the original investigation. The renewed attention brought new energy to the case, and in 2025, a significant breakthrough occurred. Police re-examined the original evidence with the help of modern forensic techniques, including DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy. This time, they had the technology to connect the dots. DNA evidence from the scene of Susan's disappearance was matched with a suspect's genetic profile, leading investigators to a man who had been living in the area at the time of her disappearance. In September 2025, the police arrested a man in connection with Susan's disappearance. This man, whose identity had been hidden for so many years, was charged with her murder. The discovery of Susan's remains in a remote area, far from where she was last seen, marked the end of a 23-year search for answers. The arrest was a significant step forward for law enforcement, but it was also bittersweet for Susan's family. While they finally had closure on what happened to their loved one, the motive behind her murder remained unclear. Investigators were confident in their findings, but without further information from the perpetrator, the exact reasons for Susan's murder remained unknown. Whether the crime was a random act of violence or something more personal, the answers would never be fully understood. For Susan's family, the arrest and discovery of her remains brought both relief and a heavy sense of sorrow. "We never gave up hope, and now we have answers," a family member said, reflecting on the long, painful journey. The years spent waiting for justice had taken their toll, but finally, the mystery was solved. While the knowledge of what happened to Susan brought some closure, it also served as a painful reminder of the years they had spent in grief and uncertainty. Susan's family would now be able to put her memory to rest, but the scars of those lost years would remain. Susan Goodwin's case serves as a poignant example of the power of modern forensic science in solving cold cases that have remained unsolved for years. Advances in DNA testing and forensic genealogy not only brought justice for Susan, but also provided a much-needed resolution for her family. The case also highlights the emotional toll of waiting for answers, how the passage of time can both heal and deepen wounds. While Susan's family now knows the truth, the long gap between her disappearance and the resolution of the case leaves a bittersweet aftertaste. For them, justice, though served, will never erase the pain of the years spent without knowing what happened to their beloved Susan. Case 7. Mark Haynes, NSW, Australia. In 1988, 16-year-old Mark Haynes, a teenager from the Gomeroi community in New South Wales, Australia, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. His death, initially classified as suicide, set off a chain of events that would leave his family searching for answers for over 3 decades. Mark was a quiet and thoughtful young man, and his death came as a shock to those who knew him. His family, especially his mother, refused to believe that he had taken his own life. They were certain that something more sinister was involved, but the investigation, limited by resources and technology at the time, struggled to provide any concrete answers. The case quickly grew cold, with no leads or witnesses to shed light on what had really happened to Mark. In the early days of the investigation, detectives focused on Mark's personal life and his relationships. They questioned friends, family, and acquaintances, trying to uncover any signs of trouble that could explain his death. The initial focus was on the possibility of suicide, with the idea that Mark might have been struggling emotionally, though his family vehemently rejected this notion. No suicide note was found, and there were no signs of depression or self-harm that would point to suicide. The investigation turned to Mark's social circles, looking for any indications of conflict or a possible motive. However, with few witnesses coming forward and no physical evidence to tie anyone to the crime, the investigation faltered. As the weeks turned into months and then into years, the case was left unsolved, its investigation pushed to the back of law enforcement's priorities. Mark's case was eventually filed away, becoming just another unsolved mystery, overshadowed by newer, more urgent investigations. The absence of DNA testing and other modern forensic tools meant that police were unable to re-examine the evidence in a meaningful way. Over the years, the police department's resources became stretched, and cold cases like Mark's were often neglected. For his family, the waiting became a cycle of hope and despair, trying to keep the memory of Mark alive while being forced to live with the painful uncertainty of not knowing what had truly happened to him. They held on to the belief that one day the truth would come out, though that day seemed increasingly distant. The breakthrough finally came in 2025, nearly 4 decades after Mark's death. In 2024, a 6-year documentary investigation into unsolved deaths in New South Wales reignited public interest in the case. The documentary, which delved into a number of cold cases, uncovered new witnesses and fresh leads that had not been considered in the original investigation. One of these leads, a long-lost testimony from someone who had been close to Mark in the days leading up to his death, led investigators to revisit old evidence. DNA from the crime scene, which had been collected but not analyzed in 1988, was now subjected to modern testing. Forensic experts re-examined the evidence using advanced techniques, including DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, which led to the identification of key individuals in Mark's life who could have been involved in his death. In October 2025, the police arrested a man in connection with Mark's murder. The arrest, though significant, came with a sense of both closure and confusion. The man, whose identity was not revealed immediately, was linked to Mark's circle of acquaintances at the time. Investigators believed that the motive for Mark's death was tied to a personal conflict, but they could not yet definitively explain why he was killed. The suspect, while arrested, was not yet charged, and the investigation continued as new information came to light. The case, which had seemed hopeless for so many years, was now at the center of renewed attention, with the hope that answers could finally be found. For Mark's family, the arrest and the new developments brought a sense of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the full truth was still out of reach. "We finally have some hope, but we're still waiting for the truth to come out," one family member said. After so many years of waiting, the emotional toll was profound. They had spent decades searching for answers, and while they now had new leads, the full motive behind Mark's death remained unclear. The family held on to the belief that the investigation would eventually provide closure, but the long years of uncertainty had left deep scars. Thank you for your incredible support. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Which story do you want to be covered, or do you